Hello and welcome. My name is Meepolis, she, they, and this is Literally Graphic. And today we are taking a look at Audubon, On the Wings of the World by Fabien, Grolleau, and Jérémie Royer. And I had to flip all the way to the back of the book to find out who did this. Translated by Etienne Gilfillan. Originally published in French by, I believe, Grolleau in 2016. I picked up the English edition published by Nobel Press in 2017. It was nominated for a few Eisner categories and a Harvey Award back in 2018, but won neither. Content notes for hunting, lots of hunting, posing dead animals, shirtlessness across genders, animals killing other animals, sexualization of indigenous women, and colonialism. This book has been on my radar for a while, but I sort of went back and forth on reading it. The reviews seem pretty mixed and the subject matter a bit hit or miss. I ultimately decided to pick it up due to some positive reviews, the fact that I'm trying to read more translated work that isn't manga, as well as trying to read more books nominated for Eisner Awards, and more books about nature. Bird watching was also something that my mother tried to get me into as a child, but I rebelled and refused. That said, last year I did get some National Audubon Society field guides for my birthday, plus I think we had a book of his illustrations growing up that I like to look at. TLDR, the name Audubon was bandied about no small amount growing up, so I did have some interest in learning more about the original figure. Talking about the creators, according to Audubon.com's review of the book, quote, Belgian illustrator Jérémie Royer was listening to a radio show about Audubon's paintings when the idea struck. The Birdman of North America would make the perfect subject for a graphic novel. Royer then sought out French writer Fabien Grolleau, and the two embarked on a 10-month-long project to turn Audubon's life into a series of comic strips. Though to portray the hero's wild adventure, Royer slipped into his natural style, drawing a world of muted browns, greens, and peaches inspired by his hikes around Brussels. He also studied Audubon's Birds of America plates online and was fascinated by the author's commitment to detail. It was so realistic, the rendering of each feather and color, along with the fact that he would stage the species as if they were still alive and place elements of landscape around them. He says, "It was science before art, but for others in his time it was art before science." End quote. Keywords that came to mind while reading this particular book were hyperfocus, destroying yourself, colonialism, Western ways of knowing, hunting, privilege, and painting. The description on Goodreads is as follows, quote, At the start of the 19th century, John James Audubon embarked on an epic ornithological quest across America with nothing but his artist's materials, an assistant, a gun, and an all-consuming passion for birds. This beautiful volume tells the story of an incredible artist and adventurer, one who encapsulates the spirit of early America when the wilderness felt limitless and was still greatly unexplored. Based on Audubon's own retellings, this embellished version of his travels captures the wild and adventurous spirit of a truly exceptional naturalist and painter. End quote. The major themes I took away from the book are the plentiful wilderness of the so-called American frontier, slowly turning into wasteland, and the folly of obsession. The way text appears on the page was fairly satisfactory. We have quote marks around text lifted from Audubon's own writing, and page layouts were very nice. The art was a bit more lackluster than I feel people let on. I mean, it wasn't unskilled, but I found the faces to be overly basic and simplistic to the point of distraction. Otherwise, the birds and the color spectrum were really very nice. But before we dive into the representation side of things, some thoughts. For one, I wanted to include a quote from the very, very, very short and concise introduction from Grolleau. Quote, Audubon's writings in particular have inspired our own retelling, which should be read as a more romanticized version of Audubon's life. We hope this will give a fuller sense of the man than the mere facts ever could. The views expressed in Audubon's writing and in the speech of characters is reflective of the oppressive attitudes and terminology of the time towards African Americans and indigenous peoples, and does not acknowledge the destruction caused by colonial expansion. End quote. And to expand a bit further, another quote from the Audubon's review back in 2017, quote, "While the graphic novel is a celebration of Audubon's work, it doesn't shy away from the naturalist's controversial moments. As much as he admired birds, he also killed thousands to study, shooting droves of passenger pigeons and even a mating pair of ivory-billed woodpeckers. He abandoned his wife, Lucy, and their children for years and showed little compassion for Native Americans and African slaves." Audubon was also deeply prideful, especially when it came to his mentor and rival Alexander Wilson. But these flaws were eclipsed by his dogged pursuit of knowledge, which helped illuminate a field people knew little about and ultimately sparked a conservation movement. End quote. Going into this book, while I didn't know much, I did realize the book would be covering a historical colonizer figure. The fact that he killed so many birds in the name of celebrating them, well, held up as one of the more shocking elements of the story across most reviews, was fairly predictable. This is what Western science and ways of knowing does. Similarly, not unique to the Audubon's review was the idea that this book does not shy away from illustrating Audubon's racist views, that even the author admits to, which I very strongly disagree with. Not that I don't think Audubon was racist, but more that I thought the book did try to gloss over it and even perpetuates some racism of its own. Because while they do pull some sections of dialogue directly from Audubon's own writing, the creators, as we already touched on, were quick to say that this was not an entirely factual piece of writing, apparently inspired by Audubon's own inclination to embellish his stories in the telling. Simply to say that the creators were free to contextualize Audubon's life and words, but chose largely not to. This is not to say that they did not want to present Audubon as an asshole. There were many ways that they leaned into this idea unashamedly, namely the way in which colonialist expansion destroyed the so-called frontier. They also illustrated how destructive Audubon's obsession with painting birds was, and how it led him to use many people around him very badly. But as far as dealing with Black and Indigenous people, it did feel much less honest. Flipping to the back of the book, one of the notes included states, quote, "This book does not show that Audubon kept slaves. The subject deserves a book of its own. We've chosen to evoke it only in this episode inspired by his writings." End quote. Which is instead a story indeed told by Audubon, but somewhat suspect to my modern ear, where he seemingly stumbles across a free Black family in a swamp that ask him to basically help them return to their old master. I feel like it wouldn't have been that hard to frame this scene in a way that casts more doubt on Audubon's story, which, as I've already mentioned, were notoriously not entirely true. It's also very random in the flow of the story itself. As far as the depiction of Indigenous people, while they do appear more often in the script, that only makes Audubon's general condescension more obvious, although I'm also working under the assumption that his actual level of racism was likely downplayed. We do have one mention of a specific Indigenous tribe, though, namely the Natchitoches, although this is a fairly random statement made by Audubon's Indigenous Guide. Otherwise, Indigenous people just sort of show up on the page with no reference to who they are. Are these based off of real people? Did the creators do any research into how these people dressed at the time? If so, it would have been great to make note of. And the only note we get in the back of the book that relates to Indigenous representation is, quote, "The character of Shogun is an amalgam of various people whom Audubon encountered on his travels, guides he met along the way, and Native Americans with whom he hunted. The final scene is based on fact. An old friend did visit Audubon before his death, witnessing his declining mental and physical health." End quote. Which, in my non-authoritative opinion, was perhaps the most insulting move by the creators, because in the name of convenience they decided to combine innumerable diverse people into one stoic and seemingly ageless, tribeless Native American man who only seems to exist to serve the white passing man of money. In other words, a quintessential stereotype. Of the creative liberties that the team took with Audubon's story, the fever dream that alludes to the question around Audubon's maternal lineage was one of the few to actually contribute to the plot. Although I had to click over to Wikipedia to really appreciate the debate, as the book was extremely vague on the subject. To clarify, I guess there have been some debates about if Audubon was of mixed race or white. Either way, he was an illegitimate child of his father's rape of a woman he either owned or employed. Not a situation where she would have had any ability to meaningfully consent. I will be linking in the description to some articles published this spring in the Audubon's magazine on the subject of both the man's lineage and the author's experience of being a Black birder. Other additions that are noted in the back of the book include a conversation with Charles Darwin about the evolution of dinosaurs to birds and the discovery of the Archaeopteryx during Audubon's lifetime. Both seem rather fanboyish, in my opinion. Despite noting in the introduction that Audubon did not, quote, acknowledge the destruction caused by colonial expansion, and, quote, this was the only context that the creators successfully introduced into the narrative. That said, they do fall victim to the racist trope that before white colonizers arrived on Turtle Island, the place was a magical, untouched wilderness. Modern research points to a large population of indigenous people actively managing the land and fostering the abundance that initial colonizers enjoyed. Still in my TBR, the book 1491 by Charles C. Mann covers a lot of this. I've linked to an NPR interview in the description. Another obvious contention that the book completely ignores is the idea of discovery. Did Audubon actually discover anything? Well, for his colonizer audience, certainly. But much like the entirety of so-called North America, indigenous people would obviously be familiar with the birds around them and would have their own ways of knowing about these birds. A very popular book that tackles the erroneous dichotomy between so-called wilderness and civilization and indigenous versus settler ways of knowing is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. 5 out of 5 stars. Linked to an interview in the description. But how was gender and sexuality treated in the book? Up and down, I guess. Audubon abandoning his wife and children to go paint birds was one of the things that the book is willing to criticize Audubon for. His commentary on indigenous women was creepy, to say the least. As I always say, queerness has existed through all time and place, but reading historical fiction from a colonizer perspective, I never expect that to be acknowledged. Some small comment about how the trajectory of Audubon's life could only have happened to a white passing man with a moneyed background would have been nice. His obsession seems to literally take him to death's door, a pauper, but the magic of who he was powered Audubon back into no small success, a presence that has certainly ballooned into an expansive modern legacy. So yeah, class was largely brushed over. And while Audubon had a number of health struggles through the story, it was still presented as everyone being fully able-bodied or nearly dead. So yeah, not a new favorite read. Initially I was thinking about rating this book 2 stars, but after writing at such a great length on the subject, I feel compelled to rate it just 1 star. Bye y'all, keep reading and resist white supremacy. And Literally Graphic is created on land that should be given back to the traditional landholders, which in this case is, to my knowledge, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, an Anishinaabe people, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat Nation.